launch of a console is an exciting time. The increased power and technical innovation promises new and exciting experiences that weren't previously possible. Therefore, a lot of pressure is put on the titles that launch alongside these systems to showcase what they're capable of. Unfortunately, launch titles often have a reputation for being underwhelming, gimmicky, or just downright awful.
You win!
With the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series finally out, I thought now might be an interesting time to go back and take a look at one of the PS4's launch titles. Killzone Shadow Fall was one of only a handful of exclusive games available alongside the PS4's release. It didn't review all that well at the time. It didn't bomb by any stretch of the imagination, and I'm sure it has its die-hard fans, who I'm looking forward to meeting in the comments, but I think it's fair to say that most people thought that it was kind of underwhelming. Despite being a fan of the earlier games, I didn't play Shadow Fall at launch. I didn't get a PS4 until 2014, and the stigma of it being a launch title, along with the allure of other, newer games, meant that I never made my way back to it. But with an entire console generation having passed since its release, my curiosity got the better of me. Did the pressure of being a launch title and all the expectations that come with that negatively influence review scores and opinions at the time? Was it possible that this was in fact a hugely underappreciated gem? As it turns out, no, it's not. If anything, its issues are even worse now. But come along anyway, and let me explain exactly why this game failed to bring Killzone successfully to the PS4, and also why launch titles often fail.
I hope you are more helpful in their return.
My first Killzone experience was Killzone 2, and at the time I was absolutely floored by it. It was an intense, visceral shooter unlike anything I had played before. The third game managed to raise the bar even further with more variety in its level design, better controls, and awesome new gameplay mechanics like the jetpack and mech. You can even play the entire campaign co-op in split screen. Shadow Fall had some pretty big shoes to fill then, and on top of that it had to deliver one of the first next-gen experiences on the PS4. So, no pressure. Shadow Fall again introduces many new gameplay mechanics. It has a new setting with much larger levels, and it tells a very different story to what came before it. You definitely can't fault this game for its lack of innovation. It also includes all the expected staples of a Killzone game, with a lengthy campaign, competitive multiplayer, and a co-op mode. It sold reasonably well, selling over 2 million copies by the end of 2014. However, this was significantly less than the previous two entries. The combination of low review scores, a small install base on the PS4 at the time, and the fact that both Call of Duty and Battlefield had games ready for the PS4's launch probably didn't do it any favours. It also attracted some unwanted press due to the controversy surrounding its resolution. The marketing claimed that the game ran at a native 1080p in both the single and multiplayer, which turned out to be a big fat lie. To be clear, Shadow Fall is not a bad game. Sure, there are certain aspects which aren't great, which we'll get into shortly, but it's not riddled with technical issues or loot boxes. It is a very beige experience though, and what I mean by that is, although many of its components are well designed, it lacks any kind of X factor. It may be the most visually impressive Killzone game ever made, but it's also the least Killzone game in the series.
You will strive for excellence. You will make us proud. The state of New Helghan welcomes you home.
One of the key differences between Shadow Fall and the earlier Killzone games is the story. Where the previous entries were testosterone-fueled epic space operas, Shadow Fall's scale is far less grandiose, choosing instead to tell a more personal tale. Set 30 years after Killzone 3 and the destruction of Helghan, the remaining Helghast are now living on Vector, albeit divided by the Berlin Wall on steroids. It's an interesting setup for sure, and the fact that many of the development team grew up during the era of the Iron Curtain gives it a sense of authenticity. You play as Lucas, who as a young boy witnesses the murder of his father at the hands of the Helghast. This is clearly supposed to provide you with the motivation to take the fight to the Helghast, but the way you're rushed through this sequence and the strange lack of emotion that Lucas displays fails to communicate the significance of this event. And I think it's this scene that demonstrates the biggest problem with Shadow Fall's campaign. The previous games were filled with entertaining characters and adventure. They were deliberately over the top and ridiculous, and didn't take themselves too seriously. This game, on the other hand, is much more serious with serious characters, and if that sounds kind of boring, then you're not wrong. Lucas has the personality of Rain Man on a strong sedative, and the rest of the cast don't fare much better. None of them are all that likeable, and the villains lack the imposing presence of Emperor Vasari or Stahl. This lady's hair is really as close as you get to an interesting character. Again, I think the story has a good premise, and it attempts to expand on the Killzone universe with some interesting ideas. Maybe if they had gone down a less serious path, a bit like Wolfenstein did with New Order, it may have paid off. Ultimately, the story ends up feeling like a missed opportunity, and is really only there to loosely tie all the levels together. On the positive side, gameplay fares significantly better, and this has a lot to do with the fact that Shadow Fall easily has the best controls in the series. This was a point of contention with the earlier games. Killzone 2 felt like you were in control of a giant sack of sand, and while the third game was definitely an improvement, it still felt pretty laggy. I actually liked this in the earlier games because it was very different to other shooters, but I understand why it wasn't universally praised. Shadow Fall retains the signature sense of weight, but it's far more responsive, and it becomes clear pretty early on why the controls have been tightened up. Gameplay has a big emphasis on platforming and exploration. According to the dev team, levels are roughly 4 times the size of Killzone 3, and are almost open world-like in their layout. They're not exactly big enough that you can take yourself off to the local stream for a spot of fishing, but you do have a lot more options in terms of how you approach each mission. Many missions have you navigating tight ledges and making precisely timed jumps. You can also sneak up on enemies and use elevation for stealth takedowns. This focus on platforming and stealth was a common complaint at launch, and I have to agree. It's not that it's particularly bad. Sure, the platforming has its fair share of frustrating deaths, but what stands out the most is just how un-Killzone it is. The previous games had you ripping oversized weapons from their mountings and taking on building-sized enemies, dropping as many F-bombs as the R rating permitted. Shadow Fall, on the other hand, has none of that, but it does have plenty of this. Okay, so that's not exactly a fair comparison. It does have a few epic moments, but gone is the macho bravado that made the earlier games so entertaining. In its place are systems and mechanics that constantly reduce the amount of time you spend shooting at stuff. Nowhere is this better demonstrated than with the Owl, a little drone that you can call in to perform a number of tasks, such as deploying a shield or taking out enemies. In close quarters, this basically eliminates the need to aggressively push forward and seek cover, which was a hallmark of the gameplay in the earlier titles. Lots of missions aren't focused on action either, and it's clear that you're supposed to be able to stealth through many of them. Again, mechanically all of this works fine, but who wants to stealth in a Killzone game? When you are actually shooting at stuff, it feels great, there just isn't enough of it. The problems with the campaign are mostly non-issues in the competitive multiplayer, although the multiplayer does have one glaring issue in 2020. You might have guessed what this is already. Yeah, there's no one playing it. You can fire up a match with bots, and they can be pretty dang tough when set to hard, but it's no substitute for playing with real people. You can't play a bot match with real people either, so this mode has very limited appeal. Now, there is a co-op component, but unfortunately it has to be purchased. Interestingly, you can buy it as a standalone, which was kind of forward-thinking from a customer acquisition point of view. It never got a physical release though, so you're looking at $15 Australian from the PSN, which is almost 4 times what I paid for the base game. This isn't exactly expensive in the grand scheme of things, but you still need to know at least one other person who owns it. So in 2020, you're kind of limited to the campaign, and as I've just explained, it's not really required gaming, even if you're a Killzone fan. Shadow Fall was one of the first games built using Decima, Guerrilla's in-house engine, which has since been used for a bunch of games including Horizon Zero Dawn and Death Stranding. Shadow Fall was actually used as a testbed for a lot of the technology that made it into Horizon, such as the large open environments. It also gave the team the opportunity to experiment with many of the engine's new features, and Shadow Fall is full of impressive effects. Much was made about this game's visuals back in 2013, and for the most part it's still gorgeous. It's a little heavy-handed on some effects, particularly the JJ lens flares, and at times it can feel as if the game is screaming at you, "This is a next-gen title, all hail how fucking shiny it is!" The lighting is the most immediate thing you'll notice. There's heaps of volumetric lighting throughout, and the way it bounces off surfaces looks really incredible. It also has real-time reflections using ray tracing. Yeah, that tech that is apparently next-gen and requires expensive graphics cards to achieve. Well, this game was doing it 7 years ago on the base PS4. Okay, so it is fairly basic, but pretty remarkable given the age of this game. The level design is another standout in the presentation, with both the Helgen architecture and their technology being a high point. Overall, it's hard to fault either the visual fidelity or the level of artistry on display, and it's easily the best looking game in the series from a technical standpoint. But it's not all good news. Character models, for example, generally look great, until they start moving. And those facial animations? Oof, no wonder I didn't connect with any of the characters. Even though it's pushing many more pixels than the PS3 games, I can't help but think that this is a step backwards. Probably the most distracting issue with it though is the frame rate. The game offers a locked 30 frames per second setting as well as an unlocked option. Unlocked has a cap of 60 frames per second, but even on the Pro using boost mode, it doesn't come close to hitting that consistently. It regularly dips into the mid-40s and occasionally drops into the low 30s. This makes for a very uneven experience and not a great way to play it. Even with it locked to 30 on the Pro, I still found it to be pretty inconsistent. And this brings me to which platform is the best to play it on in 2020. Unsurprisingly, the base PS4 has the least amount of power and can't really take advantage of the unlocked frame rate. This game never got a Pro patch, so removing the 30 frames per second restriction is really the only way to take advantage of the extra power of the Pro. But as I just mentioned, the Pro doesn't fare much better. The improvement to performance in the unlocked mode is only marginal and still wildly inconsistent. So on both the base and Pro PS4, I'd say stick with the locked 30. The PS5 through backwards compatibility, on the other hand, appears to run it at a much more consistent 60 frames per second. I don't have the tools to measure this precisely, but based on the small amount of gameplay that I've seen, it does seem to hand in a much more solid performance. So if you do have a PS5, this is undoubtedly the best way to play it.
If you attack, she will not back down. And why should she? She'd be defending her people, their home. This is all we have.
I was really hoping that the reviews had been overly harsh and that this had been mistakenly overlooked. Instead, what I discovered was a textbook launch title, a game that is more concerned with pushing the technical boundaries of the new hardware and packing in as many bells and whistles rather than delivering a genuinely fun game. Knowing that it was used to help develop new tech for Horizon Zero Dawn, it's clear that this influenced Shadow Fall's design. I don't blame Guerrilla for trying something new with the series, and I think a lot of the elements for a great game are here. Most of the new mechanics and systems work well, but when you put them all together, the end result is never greater than the sum of its parts. And worst of all, it just doesn't feel like a Killzone game. And I think this is something that many launch titles have in common. Companies are so keen to have a killer app for their new system that they put a lot of pressure on game studios. In addition to learning how to develop for a new platform and often a new engine as well, development teams are expected to include new features, support new controllers, and create something that looks significantly better than what people are used to. These companies then build unrealistic hype for these games, and the combination of high player expectation coupled with the studio's lack of experience with the new hardware often results in games that don't live up to what the marketing promised. I mean, just look at how Sony marketed Killzone 2 prior to the PS3's release. They presented a pre-rendered video at E3 claiming it was in-game footage. To Guerrilla's credit, they somehow managed to pull a good game out of their ass, but the pressure must have been immense considering the amount of hype that had been generated. So, in summary, can I recommend this on any level? Not really. I guess it's interesting from a historical point of view to see what was considered next-gen 7 years ago, but it's a perfect example that good graphics aren't the only thing that matters. The lack of multiplayer also means that the campaign is really the only way to play it in 2020, and this is where the game has aged the least gracefully. If you're interested in the Killzone games, then I strongly recommend checking out 2 and 3. They're some of the best FPS titles on the PS3 and still hold up well. Who knows, maybe I'll even do a review of those at some stage, and if that's something you'd like to see, let me know. Drop me a like if you enjoyed this, subscribe if you want more, but otherwise, thanks for your time.